All right. So, what's your opinion, Chris? Do you think that Islam represents a threat to Enlightenment values that is worse than Judith Butler?
No, I don't. I don't see any threat to anything coming out of Islam. I don't.
Right. Welcome to the Cutrone Zone. With us today is the last Marxist, Chris Cutrone. Before I pressed record, I was making him remember the Muppets.
Yes.
And I described to you how the Children's Television Workshop was funded by behaviorist psychologists who had a kind of technocratic vision on how to create a good society by creating architectures which would encourage the best, healthiest, and most polite, I guess, behavior. And you were mentioning that this attitude defined the middle of the 20th century.
That's right. So I was just, what I was going to say was that we might think of this as, neoliberal, but of course it's continuous with the mid 20th century, like Fordism.
Yeah.
It's really, what Adorno and the Frankfurt School called the administered society. Right. So it's what comes out of the failure of socialism is this kind of technocracy and kind of, really, that they thought that Brave New World was the real accurate dystopia rather than 1984.
Right. And we've discussed that before. And I feel as though we've got a great combination of both right now in a way, but we got the thought police and the cancellations and
what did they call it? The 2 minutes of hate or something?
We got the 2 minutes of hate for sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're meant to focus on individual pleasure as if that is the final form of freedom and take our soma, and everybody has their different brand of soma, I guess. Well, what did the Frankfurt School guys, Adorno and Horkheimer and those guys like or think was most accurate about Brave New World?
Well, precisely this, a kind of pacified society at the expense of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, being unfree without realizing that you're unfree.
Right.
Right. Very different from 1984.
Yeah. And, the thing I would want to underline for today's audiences is that you can fail to realize you're not free, but still think that you are oppressed. I think that you are, because the problem is not when that happens, the concept of freedom has been so diminished that that being safe and cared for and not being deprived is what's thought of as being free.
I'm not sure whether we have discussed this before, but the difference between modern and ancient freedom, between Aristotelian freedom and modern freedom.
Yeah.
Right. So Aristotelian freedom is the freedom to be what you are.
Mm-hmm.
And modern freedom is the freedom to transform what you are.
Right.
So become different.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So Aristotelian freedom, something or someone is free if they're kind of unconstrained, unhindered in their natural development. Mm-hmm. Whereas modern freedom is about the transformation of nature, of inner and outer nature, of one's own nature.
Right. Okay. And so I think that modern form of freedom is maybe not entirely forgotten, but often forgotten.
Often. And I think that we increasingly operate with an Aristotelian notion of freedom. And so everything has its nature. And to be free is to be true to that nature. And to be unfree is to be, unnaturally constrained.
Right.
Right. So it's very much in keeping with, the theme of what we've been talking about over the last several weeks, which is this kind of romantic national conception of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like when I teach about identity as a category, because I teach Adorno, so I have to teach non-identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so non-identity is about something having a potential to become different from the way it is,
Mhm.
but the difference between entity and identity. And that's from Ralph Ellison, right? From an essay in his book Shadow and Act, where he says
The problem is what?
a confusion of like identity and entity around black identity, where it's treated as a matter of being black,
Right.
right? So where race is basically a category of being as opposed to a category of becoming, right? That blackness as an identity isn't just there; it's the product of history and
Right.
is therefore changeable.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what we wanna hold on to in the face of moments which are extremely violent and disordered and regressive, like what's happening now.
This is,
It
by the way, what we talked about in terms of genocide and kind of biological genocide, racial genocide, like the extermination of a genetic race versus cultural genocide, right? The destruction of a
right,
culture. And in both cases, they're treated as categories of nature. In other words, they're categories of being. So you want to preserve a way of being,
mhm,
right? And I think that people, kind of got upset with me. I think there was a comment about like, I don't care about, I didn't even say anything about my genes. I just said if there are no like Irish Celtic genes in 300 years, I don't care. And they were like, oh,
right.
that's because he's gay. Right. They were like, oh, isn't it a natural impulse to want to reproduce your own genes? And I'm like, well, that may or may not be true, but I was talking about like a race. I wasn't talking about like my individual genes. But it's interesting how they immediately identified those things. That I would, as an individual, biologically have an interest in the perpetuation of my clan genes, Irish Celts, right? Which that where would that come from, right? Is that evolutionary biology that we were all struggling to preserve our own like tribe? I'm not
I
sure about that one. Right.
I have on the to be fair to the people who said it was because 'cause you're gay, I wanna say that as a father of 4, I have
You've done your
become
duty.
I've done that, but also I've become the kind of person who never having intended to be like this, who secretly wants my name, my family name, to go on to the next generation, and that seems important to me. Whether or not it's
What did you have? 3 sons and 1 daughter?
yeah.
Okay, so what if you had had 4 daughters? Then
Well, I know, but you know what? I think at the moment the daughter is looking like she's the most likely one to ever have children, although I don't know if any of them ever will. But I've decided that her boyfriend, when they marry, should take her name, and the children should have her name. So I'm
because
gonna
you
let
want
him.
your name preserved.
Yes, I want my name to be passed down.
And then, of
And
course, we would understand that as some kind of symbol for the genetics,
right. I
right?
guess, although I also want my books to be read in 100 years, so I don't know what it is. It's some sort of
No, this
crazy.
is the other thing, right? So it's kind of like, who are we really? Are we what we biologically are, or are we as we are socially produced as the individuals we are in our historical moment? And of course, I
Mm,
think the latter is
right.
essentially who I am, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what I've become, that there's this raw material of biology, but it's really been produced in society. And, my immortality in terms, of my identity and who I am as a social individual is not really in my genes. It's in my activity.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely. But
right.
I like to believe that the name Lane is associated with a certain kind of becoming and being, that we're a family of independent thinkers or something, and that
Oh,
we're gonna
they'll
yeah,
remember the ancestor, the
right.
progenitor of the tribe,
Yes, yeah.
right?
That's what I secretly want, and I know it's not, particularly progressive, but I think it just is what I become.
I
So
mean, look, the point of the matter is society is going to continue.
mhm,
People are having children, and whether they're children, whether they're, offspring, their descendants, whether biological or otherwise, whether like adopted children, really carry on their activity, right? That's not
Mhm.
necessarily the case, right?
Right.
We're not in the caste system. We're not in the guildcraft system
No.
where, if you're a carpenter, your son will be a carpenter, right? You're not going to pass down your skills necessarily that way, right? Your children, your spiritual children might not be your biological or familial children at all.
Right. They might
Certainly as
not
a
be.
teacher, I know that.
Right. Right, but if you had kids, you would want them both to be, I think. Y
Possibly. I mean, I don't know. I think that I'd have a lot of reticence about having them follow my life path.
Oh, no, no, well, they
Right.
I want my kids to sublate and, exceed
It's a funny
me.
thing. I'm not sure, like being an intellectual.
Right.
My family are not intellectuals. My parents are not intellectuals.
Mhm.
And so I'm not sure that an intellectual life is the best life. I'm not sure I'd want my children to be intellectuals like me
Well, that "like me" part is
or
key.
intellectuals like, like,
Yeah, but the Marxist ethos is, fisherman in the morning, poet in the afternoon, or
right, right,
what I
right,
mean?
right.
Yeah,
But in
I
terms
think
of
I think
assuming we're still living in capitalism, right? You know that Adorno famously didn't have children. They chose not to have children
Mhm.
because they said you can never know what army they might be forced to march in,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so um, forced directly or forced by circumstance, forced by history. Um,
Mhm.
and I mean, I guess this is really what we're dealing with. We are dealing with history and how is history passed on and what do we make of? I mean, in my book, Republicans and Riots, I do talk about the morbid character of seeing ourselves as the biological descendants of either the oppressed or the oppressors, right? The misery
Mhm.
of that. um, of being bound to the past that way. There's Asada Shakur, the black nationalist, Black Panther, right? She lives in exile in Cuba, and she refers to Black Americans as Africans lost in America, as if they don't really belong there. And
Mhm.
I feel like as the descendant of immigrants, am I an Italian lost in America, and am I an Irish lost in America? Do I belong here? Right? Is it just because I'm not descended from slaves that I might belong here more than blacks might belong here? But maybe blacks have earned their place here in a way that as the descendant of immigrants, I have not, you know? So, that whole question of belonging, who belongs here? Like this is a settler colonial country, the United States. Who belongs here?
I feel as though these kinds of discourses, these kinds of approaches to the problem of alienation have the unfortunate consequence of obscuring alienation itself.
Yeah,
Like,
deeply,
yeah,
deeply,
and
right?
the truth is that alienation is actually universal, whether
It,
you're from,
whether you're
Africa
living
or
in the place of your ancestors or not,
right. No,
right?
because you're actually not living in the place of your
You're
ancestors,
not. That's right.
no
History has
matter where
moved
you
on.
are.
That's
Yeah.
right, no matter where you are, exactly. And so, that's the tricky part. And of course, I was just thinking about Liberia,
Mhm.
where emancipated slaves set up a settler colonial state in Africa
Mhm.
and, set themselves up basically as a ruling class
Mhm.
who were overthrown later, but, again, it's kind of like, did they belong there? Did they not belong there? Well, then where did they belong? Right? And of course, there's the question of Jewish belonging. Do Jews belong in Israel? Well, maybe not, but then they don't really belong anywhere, do they?
How much does this have to do with the death of God? The failure of or the falling away of traditional religious beliefs that describe the world in such a way that you have a place in it, depending
Well,
upon what.
right. So the curious thing is that peoples are the products of migration.
Hmm.
Nobody's quite where they were in terms of biological ancestry. And usually origin stories for the tribe do have to do with how the gods directed them to that place. Right. So the Aztecs migrated out of Aztlan, which is in the central United States, but they migrated down to what is now Mexico City, and that was the promised land that
Hmm.
they were directed to by their chief god. Right. The hummingbird that led them out of the desert to their promised land,
Hmm.
the sun god. Right. So where do they belong? Do they belong in their ancestral home in Utah? Do they belong in Mexico? The Aztecs, right? The Azteca people. Um, right. And so you know, the funny thing is, so did we talk about this? Why Jerusalem? Why the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque? That's supposedly where God created the world, Doug.
Hmm. I thought that happened in Australia. I believe that the indigenous people of Australia are on the original land of the earth and not to this, Johnny come lately,
Yahweh,
religion. Yeah.
Jehovah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jehovah came later.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, no, it's a funny thing, right? So, of course, every, creation story, every origin of the tribe story, the world was created wherever that tribe happened to have ended up, right? To have
Mm.
founded its culture. But, the Abrahamic religions, so called Abrahamic religions, the religion of the ancient Israelites, and then in the diaspora, Judaism, and Christians and Muslims actually all, I guess, believe that the world was created there in Jerusalem. I mean, the Christians, I'm not sure so much, but
No, yeah.
the Muslims believe it was created there, and Jews believe it was created there, and that's also the rock where
So wait,
Abraham.
does that where Eden was supposed to be then? Is that,
That's
you know?
ambiguous. That's ambiguous. Yeah. So it's not exactly paradise. I mean, the question is whether paradise exists in time and space, the way we conventionally think about it. Right? But it is the place where God created the terrestrial world, and it's also the site where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac on that rock. And God,
Right, but I mean, once you've fallen from Eden, you're not where you're supposed to be anyway.
for
So,
sure, you're where God put us as punishment. Right?
right, but I mean, we shouldn't have sinned to begin with. I mean, from a
Yeah, but
Christian
that's
perspective,
that's theodicy. That is theodicy. Like there's a deep theological question. If God didn't want us to defy him, then why did he make us free to do so? Because that's really what it is. Original sin is freedom.
right? I know knowledge is another way
Yeah,
to put
but
it.
freedom to eat from the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, and we only gain knowledge out of our freedom, and we only need knowledge out of our freedom. We didn't need knowledge in paradise,
Right,
right? Because we didn't need to learn to survive. We didn't need to learn to work. We didn't need to learn to change the world, right?
right.
So, no, it's a curious thing. So I just, again, I feel like who belongs where exactly, in the world. And I know that that's just going to seem like sophistry. I know that people are like, "Oh, Chris Cutrone, his arrogance is only matched by his ignorance." And I'm sure I got some theology wrong there because I'm not a theologian, I'm a Marxist.
Hmm. Right,
And what I can tell you is that Marxism is not interested in where people ancestrally belong.
right. Well, have you ever read the book by Kurt Vonnegut called Galapagos?
Yeah.
Gal-
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is the ultimate end of the deep pessimism about freedom that emerged in the second half of the 20th century after World War II. That Kurt Vonnegut, in a very human way, in a very funny way, in a
But
very
named after Darwin, named
understandable,
after the end of the 19th century.
right? But his dream is that humanity, after nuclear war, gets stranded on the Galapagos Islands and regresses back to the level of a penguin losing their cerebral cortex and just eating fish and flopping around on the rocks all day, swimming around. And basically, this is a return to paradise. We go back to being just animals and not people caught up in ideas and ideologies and names and words. We don't have those things
So
anymore.
after the failure of socialism,
Mhm.
right? So, Marxism is consumed by history in various ways. We talked about this, how it adapts to nationalism and Stalinism. That's the big thing that it does.
Mhm.
But there are all sorts of isms, right? Oppressing us. So racism, sexism, uh, heterosexism, right? Uh, normativity, cisgenderism, speciesism,
Mhm.
speciesism. Presumably oppresses the other species, but also oppresses us, like I suppose. Speciesism, anthropocentrism, right, is also part of an oppressive um, affliction of our species, just as Eurocentrism is not good for Europeans, right?
Mhm.
From a
Yeah, because it puts a limit on our understanding to be Eurocentric,
I
makes us
guess so.
provincial, right?
I guess so,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean, it always is a little bit unclear there. In other words, once the left does away with universalism as like a patriarchal white settler colonialist discourse, right?
Well,
Then the left,
no one you can't actually do away with universalism. You can only obscure it from yourself. That's I think.
so we would say, Doug, but that's because we're engaged in the master discourse.
Okay.
Judith Butler is here to say, right,
Mhm.
that the Palestinians embody a way of life unassimilable to the American or Israeli way of life. And that's why they're targeted for genocide.
So insulting,
Is it?
really.
Is it?
I think
Respect
so.
difference.
Yeah.
Respect difference. You don't respect difference, Doug? You're only
I
willing
res-
to accept the Palestinians on your terms?
um I recognize the universal humanity in people, and I don't
Oh, I'm
expect them
sure
to
that Judith
express it
Butler
the
does
same
too.
way.
But we should
Right.
interrogate that definition of the human. Isn't it the product of disciplinarity? Foucault, the West.
Yeah, I know, I know.
No, I mean, there's a case to be made. And, you know, in the face of the
I
absence
mean,
of
look, I've rehearsed the arguments we're having now myself a number of times, and I do know the
what
arguments
if
that
we
you're
can
making,
never
but
get to socialism? What if we can never get to socialism?
hmm,
Then what? Right?
well,
Because I come back to that. In other words, if the struggle for socialism is either impossible totally or off the table for the foreseeable future, then what do we conclude from that? Then we might conclude that the main task is to preserve nature from the ravages of capitalism and then
okay, but
encourage culture.
I here's my problem. I feel as though to preclude socialism in our future, you have to have already accepted
Mhm.
the idea of being rather than becoming. You already are presuming that we are fixed and that there's something to preserve, because otherwise how can we say, oh, socialism is off the table because of these historical reasons which cannot be overcome because human beings are bounded in a certain way that we already know, and
Mhm.
therefore we can claim that
Mhm.
under these conditions, no species ever, no matter how much time and energy and intellect they put to the problem, would be able to solve these issues and break
That's not
free
the proof,
from.
though, necessarily. It isn't based on a claim, right? It's very Heideggerian. It's based on a humbleness. It's based on a circumspection. It's
But the
based on
humbleness itself is founded upon an assertion and a claim. It is not. It's like, yes, the affect is one of humility, but the claim is one of being.
well, that's the
Of
other master discourse, right? That's Freud. right? So we just switched from Marx to Freud, meaning that, or maybe Nietzsche,
Yeah.
meaning that when we think we're being, deferential and kind and compassionate and humble, really we're making a power move.
Right. I totally
See,
experience
I
that
own it.
all the time.
I own it. Meaning
I
I'm a revolutionary. I want to assert power. I do. I want
No,
to,
I know, and I
right?
when I assert power, I try to do so directly and with full knowledge, and
Yeah,
I
not
don't
not
hide
in
it.
denial, right? But what
Right.
about what if the task of life is to be aware that you're always trying to assert power, but to
Yep. You
check to
I
sort
want
of recognize and back off from that. Like in other words, when and to discover all the ways in which we're doing microaggressions, that we're asserting power and oppressing people without even knowing it. And of course, you know that we're most oppressive when we don't realize it.
I don't disagree with that in a way. I do think that
It's something of a social theory. It's just not Marxism.
no, I mean, I think it's true that in general in life, when you are completely, obscure to yourself, you're more likely to do a lot of damage. When you don't reflect and you just react,
That's an
you're and
enlightenment view, though, Doug.
it is. I know, I full on embrace the enlightenment, as
That's
well
like
as I can.
rationalistic. Can
Yeah,
I
I
say
know.
you were
Yeah.
talking with Conrad Hamilton,
Mhm.
and I was not surprised. Marxism contra subjectivity, and I downloaded his dissertation and started reading it.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's Heideggerian postmodernism. It is, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure that that is fully compatible with some kind of post-Maoism, some kind of global South, Samir Amin, some kind of world systems theory, global hegemon, right?
Right.
And but that ain't Marxism.
It led him to partially, you know, walking backwards embrace Dugin, I mean,
Yeah,
not fully,
I know
but
that he doesn't want to embrace Dugin, but he seems awfully sympathetic to Dugin, and he doesn't seem to have much of an argument against Dugin.
right. No, the
Other
rational kernel.
than you shouldn't be a fascist, but then again, Dugin did transcend fascism, didn't he?
Well, yeah. I mean, his
According to
Dugin's
Conrad Hamilton.
yeah, his critique of Dugin would be Dugin is still somewhat racist, and he has sort of a fascist
But he's
character.
not a racist, right? He's a culturalist. In other words, he recognizes culture and it is a historical variable, and the mistake of Nazism was its biological racism. That's
Yeah,
Dugin.
but right, but I think the problem is that the cultures he rejects happen to probably to match up with races that have suffered his racism. You know,
Possibly, possibly, but not intentionally and not necessarily.
right,
And again, it's we might even say that racism itself is a product of a kind of Western metaphysics that Dugin doesn't want to sign on to.
well, right, and Conrad said that, and
Right.
there's an argument there.
There is an argument there, but it would still be a kind of culturalism, and it would still be being and not becoming.
Right, but the way I would put it is that racism, um, was the product of scientific Enlightenment thinking not realizing itself,
Well,
well enough
or reifying
because
yourself.
yeah, right, no, right, but that's what I mean, like,
Yeah.
reifying categories, try trying to naturalize social
And
realities
treating
and
things as
justify
attributable. Yeah,
yeah,
treating
and
things
justify
as attributable.
politics and
Yeah,
yeah, right,
absolutely. Right. So it is about a kind of an inherent limit. And again, unassimilability of people. And you could spin that negatively or you could spin it positively. In other words, you could spin it negatively, exterminate the brutes, or you could spin it positively, you know, don't exterminate the brutes. Meaning, again, um, what are we meant to do? Because that's postmodernism with difference, right? And again, as a Marxist, but also, I feel like Adorno kind of clued me into this in a way that maybe I wasn't 100% clear on, but I think it's there in Marx. It certainly is there in Hegel,
yeah,
which is that the difference that we're concerned with is not the difference of the past, but the difference of the future. Meaning, We want to create new difference. We don't want to just preserve old difference,
Right.
right? So the goal is really diverse multiplicity, the unleashing of difference, rather than falling back on pre-existing difference, on heterogeneity. So, right, so it's not that we're from different places; it's that we might go different places.
Right. So, okay, so I'm going to now, um, someone in my head is saying, cut the bullshit. People are dying. There's people, bombs are dropping on Israel. I'm sorry, on Palestine,
Well,
on
they're
Gaza.
dropping on both. It's just that
Yeah.
one is more effective than the other.
Right. So how can we talk in this highbrow way, making excuses for let's not call it genocide, let's just call it the murder
Uh huh.
of thousands of children in Gaza. And then you know what? Look, that's actually happening.
Yeah.
Like it's not that's not that is that and I am for a ceasefire. I absolutely oppose the way Israel has decided to try to root out Hamas in this indiscriminate, violent way. I would say the same thing about it that I did when the U.S.
Bernie
Bombed
disagrees with you.
Afghanistan. I know he does, but when we and I'm not surprised. But I oppose the bombing and invasion of Afghanistan, thinking it should have been treated as a criminal
Mhm.
matter. And when it comes to Gaza,
So let's
I
let's
think something similar is the case.
yeah,
But anyhow,
let's
but I
kind
want
of
to say, like, how
yeah,
can we talk this way while this
all this is
while it's
happening.
right?
Well, again, um, I've been watching a lot of Piers Morgan because he's been interviewing a lot of pro-Palestinian activists and thinkers. And, he always comes back to acknowledging Israel's crimes, but saying, how else are you going to get rid of Hamas? And usually his interviewees, his guests, come back with something lame, which is that you can't get rid of Hamas until you get rid of the underlying conditions that produce Hamas. And, until you get rid of the oppression of the Palestinians, these terrorist groups and movements will be generated by
Mhm.
circumstances.
Yeah,
And,
because everything's a machine,
right.
right? There's
So,
there's
it's
no
it's
agency.
it's lame, but it's something. And obviously we wouldn't wholly disagree with that.
No, right.
You would not. But what he says is, you know, but Israel is bound to have to try to fight Hamas to prevent them from attacking, etc. And so let's just look at it very neutrally, politically,
Mhm.
right? So looked at politically from the cold, sober, stone cold, sober historical view that Fakri asked us to do.
Right.
Um, what are the political reasons why Israel is doing what it's doing? Meaning, how is the government of Israel bound to proceed as it must, right? So, who's the
Can
government
I
of
put
Israel?
forward
Yeah, go ahead.
one reason? I mean, one reason is that, as the state, its,
Mhm.
job is to provide security for the citizens of Israel.
Yep.
So, this is a threat to the everyday life of the citizens of Israel. Hamas has declared its intentions and acted upon them. Therefore, it has the
Clear and present
obligation,
danger.
yeah, to act in a way to secure the state. I would counter as a liberal, not a
The
Marxist,
safety of
right?
its citizens, right? Because securing
I
the
would say,
state, you
yeah,
know,
well, the safety of its citizens, right? I would counter as a liberal that the security is one value amongst many, and that along with securing the citizenry and in my everyday life, it should also preserve my freedom. And one of the ways to make sure that my freedom is preserved is to make sure that no extrajudicial
mhm,
uh, violation of anyone's rights is going on in the name of security. Therefore, dropping a bomb on a child is violating that child's liberty and right to life, and therefore the state has to both provide security and liberty. And
did I ever
that's
tell you the story of the UPS driver who was carjacked in Florida?
No,
Have we
tell me
talked
that
about
story.
that? All right, so the police stopped the UPS truck after it had been carjacked by robbers.
Mhm.
Hail of bullets, robbers are killed, UPS driver is killed, right?
Right.
Were the police charged with a crime? Of course not, right? Because they had armed robbers hijacking a truck, driving, you know, criminals, right? And of course, a car is a deadly weapon. Certainly, a truck is. And so, in the interest of public safety, they killed the victim of the crime to protect others, right?
Mhm.
Now, so, in other words, of course, they didn't want to kill the hostage,
No.
right? But they did. And they were likely to. And they had to prioritize public safety over the life of the victim, the innocent victim.
Right, which they did also on the day of October 7th. The Israeli forces did,
Yeah,
there were Israeli
there was
civilians
some
who got killed.
crossfire, absolutely.
Yeah,
And similarly
but the
here.
other thing, but what I would point out is that if we could demonstrate that,
But here's the left and the right, right? So
yeah.
the right is Israel, let's say, Benjamin Netanyahu. He will
Mhm.
say, he won't say there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. He will say the IDF is killing innocent civilians, but it's not their fault, it's Hamas's fault.
Right,
So
but
that
there
is
are
the
those within
problem.
the Israeli state and his party who've
There are
declared
some, but he's pulling the trigger, they're not pulling the trigger.
okay.
The left, on the other hand, there's no such thing as an innocent settler colonialist. No, seriously, Doug,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Seriously. They don't think there's such a thing as an innocent Israeli, whereas Israel does acknowledge that there are innocent Palestinians.
No, it's an important distinction between the 2 players. I don't know how many people on the left really would embrace this idea that there is no such thing as an innocent Israeli. There are the anti-imperialists. There's that hard Maoist third worldist position, but I don't know if that's the universal position of even the socialist
Well,
left.
the
It
Nat
seems
Turner
to
Slave Rebellion, the whites who were killed, men, women, and children, even going so far as to say that the Nat Turner rebels like beheaded babies, which I'm not sure about that. I don't think so.
they did kill children for sure.
They
They
did,
did kill,
right?
yeah. How
But
they killed them, I don't know, but they
yeah,
did.
right. And I feel like, well, but that was just. That was justified
I think the argument is that, um, yeah,
by
I mean, look,
slavery. By
the,
slavery.
it,
It's
it,
justified.
and if if I'm remembering this movie correctly, maybe I may not be, but the Last Temptation of Christ.
Oh yeah.
Okay, right. There's a moment where,
Martin
uh,
Scorsese, Willem Dafoe.
right, and who plays Judas in that?
Oh, I don't remember.
Harvey Keitel,
Oh,
isn't it Judas?
Harvey. I was gonna say like a totally unlikely
Yeah, right.
actor, Harvey.
And he says, and Jesus turned. This is how I remember it. This is probably
Is
not
he
what actually
Judas
is
or is
in
he
there.
Pontius Pilate? No, I guess he's Judas. I
He's
don't
Judas.
remember. Yeah, okay.
He's Judas, and but anyway, Jesus shows up after he's supposed to have been crucified, and
You
like,
did. You know the way you just said that he shows
yeah,
up. If he shows up like in Wayne's World, or he shows up like in Dude, Where's My Car? I like the way
exactly.
you just said shows up, but anyway,
Yeah, yeah. He just
he
shows up
shows
like,
up and he's like, "Where's my weed, man?"
yeah, and it shows up, and like Judas is like, "What the? You're not supposed to be here. You're the Messiah. No, I'm just a guy." And he's like, "No, well, even if you're just some guy, we need you as a myth. You're more than what you were." So Nat Turner is like that.
Uh,
Okay, the Nat Turner story became
yeah, it becomes
a
yeah,
myth of something more than what it was. It, in and of itself, no, it was a horrific act, but as a threat and a symbol of the horrific consequences and nature of slavery, it was worth something later to the abolitionists. So they held on to it and made Nat Turner into a
Perhaps,
hero.
perhaps, yeah. I'm just not sure how mobilized it really
Yeah,
was.
but he did. Like Jesus shows up like,
Yeah, Jesus,
"Dude, where's my
right?
car?" Not like,
And
"I'm back," but like, "Huh, what are you doing?" Like that. Exactly.
exactly, right? No, so
Yeah.
it's interesting thing because again, the conflation of John Brown and Nat Turner, I thought was significant.
Mhm,
John Brown's body as a Union song in the Civil War,
mhm,
right? I don't think that Nat Turner figured that way in the way that John Brown did, right? So, but again, that conflation. And, again, uh, we're talking about politics. In
mhm,
other words, are we interested in establishing new myths and legends, or are we interested in taking political action? And that's where I feel like, um, I mean, like, I think Lenin is a great historical figure. Do I agree with the hagiography of Lenin in Stalinism? No, right? And he
mhm,
himself would not have. And so, in other words, I'm interested in him as a real historical human being, a
mhm,
thinker, an actor. I'm interested in that Lenin. I'm not interested in some kind of strange messianic figure,
mhm,
right? Um, so again, but what kind of politics are we doing? That would work for religious politics because that's the other thing. I got attacked for saying that Nat Turner was a crazy Christian, and perhaps John Brown was too, and they're like, and I'm like, well, crazy is just a word that I use because I'm Gen X and I'm sloppy that way. I just mean crazy like wild. He's like a wild Christian. I wasn't
like
like
a wild and crazy guy.
wild and crazy guy, right? I wasn't
Yeah.
talking about like his mental health or something. I wasn't
Right,
saying he was an irrational actor, but
right.
I was saying, there were political ideologies and
Mhm,
there were enslaved people who were literate and were aware of political ideologies. In other words, it's not like if you were a slave and you were literate, the only thing that you had was the Bible. No, actually, not the case. And how do we know that? We know that from the slave narratives. We know that from literature that they produced,
mhm,
right? We know that they didn't just read the Bible, they read, the newspaper, they read Enlightenment thinkers, right? In other words, they could be political actors acting according to the political consciousness of their time. Like we don't have
mhm,
to say, "Oh, well, slave person rebelling. Their only option is like turning, the master's religion against the master." Right?
mhm,
It's like, yeah, so it's a lot of condescension and a lot of like exoticization and a lot of like ascribed motive, and so even the idea that um the Hamas fighters, you know, are just expressing the personal rage of their trauma of living in Gaza, right? And I just feel like, well,
if that's what it is, then, the blame is on Israel because they should have gotten some heavy duty medications into Gaza to help those people with their mental health issues so this wouldn't have happened.
of course they should have allowed Gaza to develop according to the state of the art United Nations developmental project of how to like, educate and care for new generations of children.
Yeah, when they've been traumatized by generational trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, the proper administration of medication and therapeutic techniques in Gaza would have been,
They should
what's
have had adequate
necessary.
social services.
Right, and since that didn't happen, then it's on Israel that the terrorist attack occurred. Of course, at this point, where's the politics anymore? Like,
There's no
what like
politics. There's no
right.
politics. There's just um well, okay, so I think that we're living in a very paranoid moment.
Mhm,
Everything is genocide, everything is anti-Semitism, everything is racism, and it's this is and I know from psychology, not necessarily even Freudian psychoanalysis, that traumatized people are paranoid. They're driven to a paranoid place. Okay, right. Here in the United States, leftists, Marxists,
mhm.
are is our paranoia excused by personal trauma? or
I
is it
don't want to
vicarious,
excuse paranoia.
right?
You know,
Is it
I
vicarious?
don't.
You know, are we
Yeah,
being paranoid on behalf of the Palestinians?
no,
Is that really necessary, right?
no.
So, what are we obligated to do? And so we're obligated not to have this psychology of counter identification, of wanting to wipe the smile off the face of Israel, right?
Mhm.
That should not be our motivation, right? That
Yeah,
should
and
not be
uh,
our orientation. That should not be our predisposition.
what about our obligation as human beings to try to put a stop to the bombs dropping, to when you can see that all that's going to happen is it's going to be one UPS driver after another with no end to the with no real damage done to the criminal class that is causing, that stole the UPS truck. It's like all you can see that this, whatever the justifications are by law and through the state,
Right.
this is simply a slaughter. What is our obligation then as
You know,
Marxists or anyone else?
I saw Jacob Siegel on Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah.
And and he said he disagrees with the war. He disagrees with Netanyahu. He disagrees with the policy. But once war is enjoined, then one is obligated to fight for victory. Meaning the only justification for launching a war is to be victorious, right? Um, and okay, so let's get back to the political consideration. I think that I mentioned, and people were comparing me invidiously to Varn. You They said Varn would never be as sloppy as I was when I talked about Hamas and ISIS,
Oh, okay.
right? And my point there was different. In other words, I said if Hamas doesn't do it, someone else would, ISIS,
Mm,
right? And the reason I didn't say Islamic Jihad, I could have said that too, is that Islamic Jihad actually are allied with Hamas. In other words, they do agree operationally. Whereas, as far as I know, there's actually been armed struggle between ISIS trying to implant itself in Gaza and Hamas.
mm,
So Hamas and Islamic Jihad have fought against attempts to establish ISIS in Gaza. So I was saying, look, if Hamas decides we're not doing the armed struggle, there might be someone else who would, right? Now, that also goes for the Israelis. In other words, if Netanyahu doesn't do it, I'm sure there are other Israelis who are waiting to do so, to bring down his government, replace it with a government to do so. Or there could always be a coup d'etat. The military could say this government is not doing its job. And in the interest of public safety, we have to remove them by force.
mhm,
That's why coups happen,
mhm,
right? And you could have a military government that says, sorry we had to do this, but the politicians failed us. And so to prosecute this war, we had to remove the politicians and we'll step down as soon as the war is over.
mhm,
Or you could have the development of Israeli paramilitaries who go and, invade Gaza on their own and, go after Hamas.
mhm.
Right. So somebody's going to do it. I mean, there right? There are communitarian conflicts throughout the world, and those are rarely prosecuted by official armies. They're often prosecuted by irregular paramilitary. There's a lot of civilian violence, and of course, in collusion with and complicity of state government authorities, turning a blind eye, but also not, also against the state authority. I mentioned that during the Algerian War of Independence, the Pied Noir did terrorist attacks in France against de Gaulle's government because they didn't want him to negotiate with the National Liberation Front. And there were people in the military, in the French military, who were sympathetic to the Pied Noir and who were indeed a threat to have a coup and overthrow de Gaulle in the context of that war. Absolutely. And so de Gaulle did have to sort of guard his flank that way, right? So Hamas doing this, because they did it, very premeditated, deliberate, years in the planning, 50th
You
anniversary of the
what about the idea that the soldiers took the politicians by surprise? You know, that it was really a homegrown just mass based attack planned by uh, soldiers, you know,
Hamas fighters.
grunt, yeah, Hamas fighters, grunts in the army,
No,
and
no,
that
no.
they,
It was no, 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 no. It was prepared for longer than that. And like I said, it's the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War,
uh,
and they've interviewed. So the New York Times has sent journalists to interview the Hamas leaders in exile, and they
mm,
said they planned, right, and it was more successful than they expected it to be, the attack, but they
mm,
knew that it was going to provoke an overwhelming response, and they said that they hoped to start a regional war.
mm.
Right? They hoped to create a situation where it would be forced, and where this would force the Palestinian issue to be on the agenda regionally. And the way you do that is to force a regional war.
Okay, so this takes me back to two things here. This takes me back to
So it's a
Jacob
political
Siegel.
strategy. It is a political strategy on the
Right.
part
So
of
it takes this takes me back to Jacob Siegel saying, since we're engaged in war, our aim should be to win
yes.
and defeat Hamas. But then the question becomes, what does defeating Hamas look like?
I
And
mean, to his
what
credit, he says they. He doesn't say we.
okay, yeah,
They.
right.
Right. In other words, just looking at the Israeli state as an actor. Right. And
Yeah,
looking from
okay.
the outside
But even then, so they should aim to defeat Hamas, and
as
they should
quickly as
go
possible.
as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. Um, that's the way forward, not this endless war. But the difficulty is,
Because that's his
if you kill
criticism
too
of.
many UPS drivers, then you begin to
Well, you
open
know
up
what
the
the
possibility of a
calculus
regional war. Go
you know
ahead.
what the calculus is, though? The calculus is you're either gonna kill a lot of people right now, or you're gonna kill more people over a protracted long period.
Well, do you? There's been there's a UN official. I don't know who it was. I just saw this. Goes across my screen, but who argued that because the Palestinians are an occupied people living
Oh, he's the
within
special
Israel.
rapporteur.
Huh?
He's the special UN special rapporteur to the Palestinians, right? It's a French word, right? The
Right.
word of diplomacy. So he's the rapporteur, he's the rapper, he's the talking guy for the UN. Yeah, and he
Right.
said they have a right to resist and armed resistance because they're an occupied
Yeah,
people.
not only that, but somebody else who was not Palestinian or representing them said the French. I mean, I'm sorry, I was thinking it was a French UN official as well, but that the Israelis don't have the right to self-defense.
Oh, that's the same guy. That's the same guy.
It's
So
the
he's
same
not
guy. I was
a
thinking.
Palestinian, but he's a UN envoy to the Palestinians.
Okay, all right.
And he
Yeah.
said that occupiers don't have the right to self-defense. Okay, by who? Right? Like in other words, you don't expect them to defend themselves?
Well, it's a question, right? I mean, if let's say a Native American reservation in the United States got armed by by Trudeau. Trudeau sent arms into the Native Americans, and they launched a terrorist attack and killed a
Would
thousand
the US
people.
government have the right to self-defense? Of course they would.
Yeah, well, maybe not as a maybe they couldn't treat the natives
But there
on
are
the
treaties
reservation
there.
as
There are actually treaties there in a way that there
right.
isn't with Israel and the Palestinians.
Oh, okay, right. Right.
Right.
Okay. The reservations have sovereignty in a way that the
That are
Palestinians,
recognized, yes.
yeah,
And they
do
have a
not.
recognized treaty relationship, meaning that they've given up foreign policy rights to the US government to
All right.
protect.
So let's say that, some gangs in New York get together, like the gangs from the Warriors, the ones that dressed up like baseball players and I don't know, the mimes. I think there's some mimes, and they get
Attacks.
together and they attack downtown New York and they kill 1,000 people, and then they run back to Coney Island. Would the police be justified in destroying a good part of Coney Island and killing many thousands of people in an effort to get those gangsters that had come and killed 1,000 people in New York City, Manhattan? You know, uh,
Right, it would
that
be one
that's
of
the
these
question,
things. Yeah, it's
right?
political, meaning that, it would be a political calculation. Meaning,
Right.
who are you gonna defend more? The people who are crying out for blood to stop it? or the people who are going to be bloodied in the
And
suppression of this.
I think that the good liberal position is to say, we will fight these criminals. We'll try to get the ones who are the leaders right away using good put Colombo on the case. We'll
You
kill them
know,
or
the
bring them
Ronald
in,
Reagan,
and we'll accept that there's going to be even more people killed than the ones we'd kill right now in the long run, in order to avoid the state
well,
killing them now.
then they get voted out, or they get sued in court, and they get impeached. I mean,
Not if they did a good job of taking the ringleaders who you make a big
oh,
scapegoat
okay,
on,
well, that's different. Well,
you
the
know?
thing is, right. So the thing is, what are they trying to do? Because I also saw some discourse about this, about like defeating Hamas versus destroying Hamas.
Yeah, right, that was on Glenn Greenwald.
Right. So
That's Jacob Siegel again.
yeah, so defeating Hamas means destroying their or impairing their will to fight, whereas destroying Hamas means making them incapable of fighting. Right? So defeating means that you kind of force them to surrender, as a choice, and destroying means you're not even giving them the choice because you're taking
And
away
he
their
was
ability to
advocating
fight.
for he was advocating for destroying Hamas, not defeating them, I think.
I don't know. Was he advocating, or was he describing why the Israelis
I
fight?
think he accepted that defeating them was going to be almost
More
impossible,
difficult. More
whereas
difficult.
destroying them would be possible.
Possible.
You could kill all the current leadership, but you couldn't defeat Hamas
And you could
politically.
destroy their infrastructure and,
Yeah.
affect their ability to launch attacks from Gaza into Israel. Yeah.
But you can't kill an idea.
Right, but you can't force them to give up the will to fight.
That exactly.
Yeah.
And even
Well,
if you kill the current leadership, there will be others who will have the will to fight later on.
that's right. And so, it does come down to politics. And
Right.
that's why the body count doesn't really capture what's really going on. Because at the end of the day, and this is where we started out in our first discussion about this, when I said I was reading Hegel, and
Mhm.
Hegel talked about military transactions, that, military conflicts are just moments in a negotiation, right? And of course, we think, it's either violent or nonviolent, it's either negotiated or it's military. No, actually, no, right? Because when does military force happen? It happens when negotiation breaks down, or
Yeah.
it happens when one
But
side.
violence alone never is enough. You can't just kill. I mean, I suppose there are times where if you just Genghis Khan style go in and murder everyone in a country or something, then you could settle things that way. But otherwise,
But even then, it
um,
wouldn't necessarily settle it, because either Israel or the Palestinians exist in a larger world, meaning
right,
they do have to relate to other countries, to other polities. In other
right,
words, ultimately, let's say that, I don't know, the Hamas got a secret weapon that could kill all genetic Jews, like a biological weapon that they could release and kill all the Jews in the historic land of Palestine. Right. Well, how would the rest of the world deal with them after that? Probably
not
not too
well.
nice. Probably not
Yeah,
too
but
nice.
probably a lot of them would die.
Well, there's that. But let's say that's why it's like a secret weapon. It's like some kind of other kind of.
No, I mean, like they're gonna
It's
find
not.
out that
It's
there's
not.
some Jewish blood
Not
with them.
using Jewish science, Doug.
Okay,
Maybe
all right.
use the science of Dr. Jakub.
Okay, all right, fine.
Right.
Um,
So we got some Martian science that actually can distinguish between different Semites,
right, right.
right? And so, right, but like, so at the end of the day, whoever wins still has to deal with the rest of the world. Like,
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
if one side wipes
But
out the other side.
and that is exactly the position Israel's in right now as well when it comes to how many people are dying in Gaza. And Israel had a
It's
big
a diplomatic problem for them. It is.
they had a big PR bump after the October 7th attack. In America anyway, more Democrats than ever supported Israel, more Republicans than ever, all across the board, an increase in support for
Because, by
Israel.
the way, like, so it's not a good look for Israel to kill all these Palestinians. Just the way it's not a good look for me to like quote Adorno and be this arrogant prick.
Right, I know. That's
Right?
right.
It's not a good look. And I'm like, motherfuckers, it's not about looks. Like
That's true.
actual politics. actual politics, is not
Right.
PR.
Yeah, but in the United States, this is the dirty secret. In the United States, our politics aren't really all that much about what it's about
No,
over
it's
there.
all about how it looks because actually the differences are pretty minor.
Yeah, what it's gonna be about is like,
It is
how
a
will this affect
popularity, yeah, it's a popularity contest.
how does this
Yeah.
affect Biden? Is Trump gonna look better? Will the Democrats get split on this? And the people who are out there on the street, protesting against the Israeli bombardment of Gaza are also calculating that this will damage the Democratic Party and hurt Biden's chances in
Because it's gonna
2024.
hurt the youth vote, right? And
Yeah.
there's a generational divide. And, younger people are more anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist, anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and that would go maybe for Jewish kids too, right?
Mhm.
Maybe the anti-Zionists outnumber the Zionists' children, possibly the college kids. I don't know, you know. And so, all of these things, these are Democratic Party constituencies. There is such a thing as the Jewish vote.
No, absolutely. And the younger Jewish voters, even the Jewish voters are more sympathetic to the
Oh
Palestinians than
yeah,
they're by
absolutely,
far. And
for sure.
and so yeah, so it's going to possibly have that consequence. I don't think though that it will necessarily have that consequence because I think it's not consciously being done with that impact in mind. It's not like people are telling themselves, "I'm gonna go protest this in order to undermine Biden because I wanna make them pay." It's like a secret even from the people who are doing it.
They
I th
might be intentionally doing it. In other words, this is a negotiation, and it is like a struggle over like congressional resolutions and verbiage, and like Bernie,
Why
Bernie.
didn't Bernie support the ceasefire, do you think?
Well, a number of things, right? So it's not like simply a policy. In other words, he could in privately in his own thinking acknowledge the injustice and impossibility either or of a ceasefire. Hamas has got to go. That's what he said. But he's a political person, so I think that when he said that, I would say, what would the left say? They would say he caved to pressure, right? Um, I'm not so sure, right? In other words, maybe he does want to be some kind of broker between wings of the Democratic Party,
Mhm.
where he maintains his credibility, where he risks his credibility, but he realizes he's not going to entirely lose his progressive credibility, right?
Mhm.
To be closer to Biden on this one, right? Because again, it's interesting. Biden, they are criticizing the Israelis. They are, right? And I know that the left, in their rhetorical position, are like, Biden is like giving cover for genocide. Well, no, actually, he's not, right? I mean, I know that from their perspective because, again, they're fighting over rhetoric, right? But if you want to know what Biden's trying to accomplish, what Biden's trying to accomplish is to keep the Israelis on a leash.
Yeah, well, that's what I figured.
The right
Yeah.
wing is there to say that that's what he's doing, and they're probably right about that. In other words, of course, they're tendentious and rhetorical too, the
Oh,
Republicans,
yeah.
right? Of course they
Right.
are, but they're probably more accurate about that than the progressive opposition to Biden is, right? So
Mhm.
they're both engaged in dishonest rhetoric. So Biden being attacked from the left and attacked from the right, they're both dishonest in their rhetoric. But I feel like actually the right is probably more accurate as to the significance of Biden's policy.
Well, Glenn Greenwald has pointed out how Joe Biden has been an adamant supporter of Israel throughout his whole career.
Yes.
And he ran a long series of clips where Biden has said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Sort of like
Sure, sure.
need Jesus, even if he just showed up
Well, if
and hadn't.
COVID-19 didn't exist, they would have had to have invented to
Right,
keep Trump from
exactly.
being reelected in 2020.
Right. But if Israel didn't
And
exist, we need to
they did
invent it.
invent it. That's
Right.
convenient. right? Anthony
Not
Fauci.
well, that's actually true, but we're going to get canceled from everything if now, not by our own viewers, but by
By
the
algorithm,
algorithm. But no,
by
the
digital
point
drone
is,
strike.
why did Biden say that? What is in the strategic interest of the United States from Joe Biden's perspective, and from the perspective of the kind of center of the blob, or the DC consensus?
I
What
mean,
is it?
Jacob Siegel's probably right about this,
What?
which is that the US wants a clientele relationship with all parties, meaning he wants the Israelis, Biden wants the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Saudis, the Iranians to all be clients of the US,
Well, sure,
right?
yeah.
And that's one way of approaching things because they kind of are clients of the
But
US.
why Israel in particular? What I mean, they're why would you need so the state
They
that
play
the
them off
other
each other.
clients,
They
right?
play them off each other, right? In other words, they think that stability is brought about through a kind of um, management from above. I mean, the little bit of the incoherence of his perspective is that he thinks the Trump policy was correct and more effective, which is to basically deal with people as participants in a negotiation. So countries are not clients; they're allies, they're enemies, and as allies or enemies, you negotiate terms. And he thought that was better for all concerned, that it puts the US in a more honest position and it puts the people that the US is dealing with in a more honest position rather than this clientele relationship, which is, you know, damaging for all parties. Right. So I think that he even made the argument that the US is on both sides of Russia Ukraine, which is, of course, true too.
Mhm.
Right. Because even though they have a sanctions regime on Russia, of course, they are allowing Russia to earn money on the international market in their own way. And in other words, it's assumed Russia's going to be able to sell some oil, right? So, in other words, it's all kind of baked into the situation. And that's what he was saying about the Middle East.
So what does it mean to be a client? Is it something like a trade partner, and
Dependency.
someone who owes
Dependency.
you money,
Yeah,
one way or another?
dependency. So the idea is that um, actually Biden does want a negotiated
But
settlement.
by that logic, we are the clients of China, and actually Europe as well, and a lot of other places, the US, because we have a dependency on the rest of the world.
So, I was watching Yanis Varoufakis and his
Mhm.
thesis on the global minotaur, which is to say that the world system remains American and like agreeing a deal with countries on the basis of the yuan and like, giving loans or whatever, right? To developing countries. All that means is that the US has offloaded the risk to China. So China's like a buffer for, kind of taking on the risk of third world debt rather than directly
Right.
to the IMF. Because ultimately, Chinese assets are based on dollar values. So you're just putting an intermediary. So it's not about China replacing the US or the yuan replacing the dollar. It's just putting the yuan in the intermediary function in the global economy to be able to absorb some of the risk of like debt default.
What
I watch Fox News and the Republicans are like, the Democrats are aiding and abetting the rise of China. Well, no, the Democrats are banking on the idea that the rise of China can ultimately serve US interests. So I would say it's not that the US is a client of China, it's that China is a client of the US.
Okay. Well, I mean, so you're
Hand to hand.
saying so being someone's client means that you lose in relationship to them.
It doesn't mean that, it means dependency. And of course, the US does think like this policy, this clientelist policy, I'm sure that they believe that it is ultimately in the interest of China.
Right.
Right.
But if you set up a buffer like that in China, and then that buffer goes away,
And
you
by the
may
way,
find that you needed that buffer. Aren't
yeah,
you dependent? Doesn't your system become dependent
sure,
on
but
that?
it's still in a subordinate role. And the reason that I'm saying
Right.
this
It's a
is that
subordinate role, but there's a for the US may, yeah, the U.S. kind of dictating these terms to try to keep the whole system
The
going in
U.S. is
service
trying to
of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, the U.S. is trying to control the rise of China in the same way that it controlled the rise of Japan and Germany,
Right. Do you
right?
remember how afraid everyone was of Japan in the
Yeah,
80s?
I know, that's so silly. In other words, the left has been like this. And there is a kind of petty bourgeois hysteria that does think that international trade is a zero-sum game. It isn't. And
Right.
so basically, what's the difference between Trump and Biden on China? The difference is simply tactically management styles. They're both trying to manage the rise of China in the greater interest of the US and of China. They just think that one policy versus the other policy is the way to do it. And it's like a carrot and stick approach, and the balance of carrots versus sticks and which sticks you use and which carrots you use. That's the only thing they really disagree on. They don't disagree on the fundamentals. The
Right.
fundamental is you want the
But
rise of China to benefit the United
which
States
one's
and China.
using the carrot? Which one's using the carrot? Which one's
No,
using
they're
the
both
stick?
using a combination.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it seemed to me that Biden has been using the stick even more than Trump did. I mean, there's a threat. It's
That's
been
true. And they can both accuse each other plausibly, credibly, of selling out to China
right.
because that is the dishonest rhetoric. Neither is really doing that. And by the way, so from Biden's perspective, right? He's like,
Mhm.
look, if we don't manage the rise of China correctly, then we might get Trump or worse because they're not so afraid of Trump's China policy. Like everything's not a geopolitical thing. It's not like, oh, they're against Trump's foreign policy and therefore the deep state. No, they're against Trump on any number of reasons, right? They don't want there to be a white Christian nationalist electorate that's a real force in American politics that's pandered to,
Mhm.
right? There are all sorts of reasons to oppose Trump. But if you want to successfully oppose the Trump phenomenon or the rise of something even worse, then you gotta succeed in some way, right? You gotta undermine the ability for an alternative policy to be offered. And you do have to coerce your political opponents into agreeing on fundamentals and having a basic consensus. And again, my point about Trump always from the very beginning, from 2016, why not Trump, is that this is all hysteria and exaggerated because there's so few differences actually between Trump and the Democrats, especially between Trump and the Democrats.
Mhm.
But let's say that he has differences with mainstream Republicans. In other words, people have made it into he's an extremist, he's outside the norms, this and that. And it's like, well, clearly not. So what is it about? It's about electorate, right? And it's about
Mhm.
like, do you want to like upset the way the Democrats and the Republicans have agreed to compete, right?
Mhm.
Or do you want to introduce a kind of a wild card, as Chris Christie said back in the day, the chaos candidate, right? Do you want to bring a level of uncertainty into electoral politics in the United States? You might not want to do that, right? But then you got to perform. You do have to succeed in some way. And this is all that these people are about. In other words, if we think of like Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas, by the way, are not worried about elections.
No.
Netanyahu is, but if you think that who Netanyahu is like a militant settler colonialist who wants Judea and Samaria, wants the West Bank, and can undermine the Palestinian Authority by supporting Hamas in Gaza so that you can say, look, the Palestinians can't govern themselves, so we're going to get rid of Hamas in Gaza. And, while we're at it, let's get rid of the Palestinian Authority and, right, the West Bank too. If you think that that's who he is essentially, then you're ignoring the fact that this is a parliamentary politician for decades. Of course, his main thing is winning elections. That's his
Mhm.
main thing. And he's a mainstream politician
Mhm.
in Israeli politics, right? This is not like fascism. It's not like, again, like the US turned fascist in 2016 when Trump was elected, or Israel turned fascist when this or that, when Netanyahu was, came back in and passed this law or did that. No, 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 no. Right. So it's all a calculus. And just at a very basic level, the military action that he's taking is based on that calculation. And he does have to worry about there are protests against the war now in Israel,
I know.
right?
And they're being built on the backs of protests against his corruption and
Sure.
judicial reform.
The
Yeah.
same people, and maybe this is going to be more widespread actually than the other
But it was
protests.
pretty widespread, the other, I thought.
Yeah,
I
this
read,
could
yeah.
be even more. So in other words, he's having to, can he rally people out of the Hamas attack to get more support? Is he endangering the support that he already has? Is he, because he's taking a risk. He's taking a risk. And what if the military operation goes south? It's a big risk.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people in Israel, or at least there are people who I've seen on American television from Israel who've said, or American internet, who said Netanyahu failed to utterly the
Utterly
October.
failed to defend
He should,
Israel.
yeah, he should step down.
That's right. Absolutely. A lot
Um,
of people are saying that. And so this is what he's thinking. So he's thinking, how do I do this in such a way where, it's going to be effective? That's like really important, right? Where it's not dilatory, it's not like going to get them bogged down, where it's effective, where it might offend foreign public opinion, but not too much,
right,
right? And where ultimately he can succeed and that will seem to justify the collateral damage, right? I mean, that's what they're thinking. And they're also thinking, that there are political competitors waiting in the wings.
right.
Like that's the main consideration, right? It's a political I mean, it's a democracy of whatever kind. I know that this is not like this.
Well, listen, I mean, I feel like we started off by saying the problem with the left is too fixed to the idea that there's a being, a way of the way things are in
Mm,
the world that are fixed, and we really need to get to the idea that there's a becoming and that things can change. And then by the end of this, now we're talking about things like,
realpolitik.
yeah, like
But I'm
realpolitik
just
and
saying we need to know that in order to think of what do we want to change and how do we want to change it, right?
right,
And that by setting impossible goals, like eliminating Israel as a settler colonial state,
yeah,
right? And where that means, I don't know what that means because it can mean all sorts of things, you know? Like I don't think Rashida Tlaib is secretly, you know,
well, does it mean a two-state solution? Is that all it means? With some people having the right of return in Israel, like we give them back some, get rid of the settlers in the
it
West
could
Bank,
mean that, but generally
relocate the settlers, and then
I would say the
choose.
left, I would say the left
Mhm.
are not two state. They're one
Right.
state.
I'm a one-stater myself, but I'm not a one-stater on, you
Capitalistic
know,
grounds.
right? Like you right? No, you know what? Even like just give everyone in Israel and the territory that's called Palestine the right to vote. Give them equal protection under the law. You know,
That's a one state.
that's a one-state solution. I'm a one-stater, and give them right to free speech and free assembly, and draft. You know, maybe redraft or draft a constitution and live with the
Well,
consequences.
it could be that
I guess that's revolutionary, but it's like bourgeois
it's
revolutionary,
not
right? I mean,
necessarily revolutionary. And again, you could say that the Palestinians themselves might not vote for that.
no, I know there's
They
not. I
might not
mean,
vote for that. They might want more self determination,
right.
right? And
Right.
then,
They wouldn't they basically, they won't believe that those, even if they have them formally, that they'll really have them, which is a
and of course,
problem.
the question is, and this is why the settler colonialist thing rears its head, is that would the Jews in Israel vote for that? Maybe not,
No, probably not. Well, they might,
right?
but you'd have to build it up as a, they might, but
Not
be,
now, not in the
not
foreseeable
now, but
future.
maybe, you know, if the October 7th hadn't happened, like it, because there was already a need for the defense of bourgeois rights, right? In Israel.
Of
That
course,
was what the judicial reforms.
and there is a large Israeli constituency for better policy towards the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Absolutely. right? But again, the question is, well, is that some kind of like liberal humanitarian undermining of the Palestinian way of life that's even more insidious
Well,
than the
I'm fine with it
liberalist?
if it is, you know, like I'm
Right,
okay
right.
with
But I'm just saying, why would the left
what is a
want?
Palestinian way of life? Getting bombed by Israel? I mean, what are we talking about here? Is the great Palestinian way
I
of life?
saw an interview with Elon Pape, right,
Mhm.
who's a dissident, and he said, well, the Palestinians know how to grow herbs, and we buy ours at Walmart. Right,
Yeah,
and do we want the Palestinians to give up growing their own herbs, or do we want them to buy GM
look,
herbs
man,
at Walmart?
I'm in the Pacific Northwest. You can not only grow herbs here, but you can sell it legally. It's okay.
Not herb,
Oh,
herbs.
what? Oh.
Right. Um, no, but, and he's like a
I knew
liberal.
what you meant. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
No, he's a
Uh,
liberal. And, so he's not like a total reactionary, but he started sounding like Judith Butler there. It sounded a little
oh no,
Heideggerian.
it sounds so worse. Like they want to. We want to protect their rights to do their interesting primitive folk dances, and and,
I mean, it's fine. I mean, look, we might not want just GMO herbs.
no, but that's a separate question.
We
That's
might
not the
want some
question.
artisanal herbs. We might want some boutique herbs,
Yeah,
right?
and
We might not
okay,
want everything to be Walmart. We might want some shishi rich people's shop of herbs.
yeah, and we might even want a society where it is we could have something other than GMOs and not have it be boutique
That's just
bourgeois.
utopian though, Doug, because people are dying now. Again, people are dying now, right? And so, the question is, what are they dying for? Right?
Right, and that is the question. What are they dying
What
for?
are they dying for? And we talked about this last time. I hope that the Palestinians aren't dying just to salve the conscience of some Western liberals.
Yeah, listen, what why don't we pick this up from there in the second half? We've been talking for an hour and 22 minutes. I feel as though I felt very relaxed in this first half, which probably means I'm just gonna get trounced
Well,
after we
because
put
you're
this
letting
out.
me get away with murder again, Doug.
I'm letting you murder people. So I
Every
shouldn't let
word
you
that I'm saying,
Yeah,
right? Every
yeah.
every second we're wasting, bombs are dropping,